We're away.
We're away. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for the Biosecurity webinar, which will give you an overview of the new biosecurity legislation which comes into effect from July 2016. I'm Christine, I'm a Sport Development Officer for Equestrian Queensland. We're very fortunate to have David McNabb from Biosecurity Queensland here to give this presentation. Before I hand over to David, on the right hand of your screen, you'll see there's a window. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please just write your question into that screen, into the question box, and David will be able to answer these as we go through. We'll also have a bit of time at the end to try and answer any questions that David's able to. Please bear in mind that David will only be answering questions relating to the biosecurity legislation. And if there's any questions that can't be answered tonight, we'll try and answer these at a later date. So over to you, David.
Okay, thanks Christine, and to you and Equestrian Queensland for inviting me here along tonight to present what is about the fourth or fifth one of these things I've done with the horse industry. We're needing to increase our rate of engaging with you guys around the implementation of the Biosecurity Act. So hopefully this won't be the last time you'll have an opportunity with what we're doing. So for those who don't know me, my name is David McNabb. I'm from Biosecurity Queensland. I have a nice fancy title of Industry and Liaison Officer. I can't even remember what it is. Old-fashioned speak, I'm a stock inspector from the DPI. I've been involved with the biosecurity planning process with the horse industry since its inception. I've actually taken over from Fiona Thompson. Most of you are probably aware of Fiona Thompson, but we've been working together now for quite a period of time. So this whole process is just reinvigorating what we did 3 or 4 years ago, and it's really timely because we now have the implementation of the Biosecurity Act to come in. So a couple of apologies for me first. I have a bit of a cold tonight, so if I start breaking down into coughing, my apologies. And secondly, I've never done one of these webinars before, and I am literally sitting here staring at a computer screen, which is weird beyond all belief. So if I look weird from that side, I'm feeling your pain because I'm feeling really weird from this side. So please bear with me. Questions, you have an ability to type in the questions, and I can see some of them as I go apparently, although I'm not too sure where they're popping up. I don't mind questions as we go. I'm used to standing in front of people and doing this, which is a little bit more engaging, and I'm used to taking the questions as I go. So if I'm saying something that you need to question straight away, please type them in, and if I miss it, hopefully Christine, who's sitting at another computer, will pick up on them. So as mentioned, I am here to talk about the Biosecurity Act and the general concepts behind that. I will use Hendra virus as an example because clearly the Hendra virus is one of those risks that you as event organisers and individuals will have to identify and deal with. But I do want to make this abundantly clear. I don't want to make this session about a Hendra virus information night, okay? I am heavily involved in the management of Hendra virus and the development of procedures and policies with Biosecurity Queensland. So I do have an amount of knowledge that I should be able to answer a lot of questions, but I don't particularly want to turn this into a session about Hendra. I want it to be more about the general biosecurity obligation and how that relates to you guys as event organisers and individuals. And the first time I hit the button there, Christine, it's not working. Sorry. Let me try another one. Nope. Sorry, bear with us. I'll have to use the slide. Yeah. Okay, so I am from Biosecurity Queensland, and for me, we've been using that title now for... I have lost my screen. Does that mean they've lost me as well?
No, they've still got you.
All right, cool. Sorry, apologies, people. And to me, having worked in Biosecurity Queensland since its inception, it just flows off the tongue nowadays. But to some people, biosecurity still may be a little bit of a foreign word. Don't be too scared by it. It's just a simple term that we use for a couple of concepts. It's just management and hygiene practices that restrict the movement of pests and diseases. The new Biosecurity Act that we're implementing replaces 9 old pieces of legislation, and it accumulates them all into one piece of legislation. It is really timely that we do these. Some of these pieces of legislation that we're working under are literally 100 years old. The Stock Act, which controls things like Hendra virus and cattle tick movements and a variety of other things, it is 100 years old, so you can imagine it is time to update it. Excuse me. So it's replacing 9 pieces of legislation, but it encompasses all of Biosecurity Queensland's business. So whereas the Stock Act was very clearly about animal diseases and nothing but animal diseases, clearly by its title, the Stock Act, the Biosecurity Act is not specific to any one subject. It encompasses all our business, which for Biosecurity Queensland includes animals, it includes plants, but it also includes our invasive plants and animals, the wild dogs and those sorts of things. So increasingly you're going to have to get used to hearing terms such as biosecurity and biosecurity risk and biosecurity matter and what is a carrier. So we're using those terms because it defines...
Muted. Unmuted.
Don't know if you did it or I did it. Hopefully we're back.
how long ago did we lose that?
Somehow we managed to mute ourselves.
How long ago did we lose that?
Can anyone let us know which slide we're on?
Oh,
About 30 seconds ago.
Okay. So I'll just talk to that slide that we're on now. So the Biosecurity Act comes into effect in the 1st of July next year. The Act itself has already been through Parliament, and it doesn't commence until the 1st of July. So what we're now doing...
David, the previous slide apparently. Sorry, I'm just getting some feedback from the guys here.
Okay, just talking around what biosecurity is. So it's a word that captures all our business nowadays. It's not just animal specific or plant specific. Biosecurity is the management and hygiene practices that restrict the movement of pests and diseases. So it's a breadth across all our business in Biosecurity Queensland, including plants, including animals, and including our invasive plants and animals. So the Biosecurity Act comes into effect in the 1st of July next year. What we are doing at the moment is developing all of that, what they call subordinate legislation, and that's the regulations and guidelines and codes of practice and all the rest of it. So what is majorly different about the Biosecurity Act and some of our old legislation is older legislation is very much prescriptive. So if we continue along using the cattle tick world as an idea that you should all be aware of, it prescribes to exactly what you will do with your animals to get them across the tick line. So you must pre-treat them with a certain type of chemical a certain number of days prior to fronting up at the clearing dip, where you'll be inspected, and then you'll be treated specifically with another chemical. Then you'll be given a permit, and that then allows you across the line. The Biosecurity Act is more contemporary than that. It doesn't get so prescriptive. It just gives you options, and it's all about an outcome. So the outcome will be that we don't want you to take your horse, your carrier, from the infected area to the free area with this thing, biosecurity risk, called a cattle tick. And what we will do is we will develop things called guidelines or codes of practice, and we will give you options as to what is the best way to go about doing that. Okay? So it's more similarly aligned to the Animal Care and Protection Act and the Workplace Health and Safety Act, where they're not specific. They just give you that duty of care concept. And under this Act, we'll have this concept called the General Biosecurity Obligation. I'll get into what the GBO is in a minute. So at the moment, we're madly scrambling to put in effect all those regulations. We will be assessing what are those higher risks that need to be dealt with a little bit more firmness, and some of those will be cattle tick. So we will be defining that there will be 2 zones in Queensland. One will be called the tick infected area, one will be called the tick free area. But where it gets a little bit more duty of care concept is we would just give you options of how you go about crossing the line. Then it's up to you to abide by your general biosecurity obligation to make sure that you don't take cattle tick across that line. There is a significant amount of consultation has gone on in the past 4 or 5 years with the horse industry, and we're certainly well engaged with the industry at the moment around those key areas. Certainly one of them is cattle tick. You may, some of your member organisations may be playing a part of that. So these next few slides just put just a few words. Some of those are the words that will be used out of the Act. It's a framework that facilitates timely and effective biosecurity responses, and it is all about protecting human health, the economy, and the environment and social amenity. So again, it gives a lot more flexibility. We can, when new diseases pop up, they don't have to be named and given a specific name for us to be able to deal with them. It's certainly one of our problems under current legislation. Until it's definitively diagnosed and we have a 100% firm answer, we can't actually legislatively act on a lot of situations. It was certainly one of the problems during equine influenza. We couldn't shut the gate until we had a definitive diagnosis come back from a lab. And if you're aware of what went on then, those first few days coming out of Morgan Park was critical for the spread of that disease. So under the Act, it gives us a lot more flexibility when we can assess a risk and see what's going on and make decisions. And again, this is just an idea of the breadth of this piece of legislation. It's not just about animals. So there's all the chemical residues, cuts across plants. The word machinery there again, just previously, if you could hear me, I was talking about the terminology called a carrier. So in our world, a carrier will be a horse, cattle, sheep, whatever. In some other worlds, such as invasive plants and weed seeds and things like that, machinery can be a carrier. So we have an option to control and state that people should do certain things to ensure they're not spreading those sorts of things around the countryside. Okay, this next slide there is one of the key underpinning concepts behind the Biosecurity Act, and that is what we call the shared responsibility. And it's the principle that all parties bear their share of responsibility for mitigation of biosecurity risks. So there's basically three individual components to that. The individual plays the role, industry/community plays a role, and government plays a role. The government is in a different space in this day and age when it comes to the implementation of legislation, in particular in our world. The basics of it is we no longer are going to be in the space of the day-to-day management of those risks. That gets pushed back to the individual and industry to manage those. And again, the cattle tick model is a prime example of that. Once upon a time, there used to be dozens of inspectors from one end of this state to the other out there on clearing dips, spraying the daylights out of horses and cattle. Nowadays, that is done by private citizens under frameworks that have been developed and monitored by ourselves. So if we just build on that shared responsibility concept a little bit more, clearly you as an individual has a role to play, and that's where the vast majority of society's legislation begins and ends. You as an individual have a responsibility to do the right thing when it comes to the community. So in this situation, it's the right thing to do when you identify your risks, assess what they are, and develop mitigation strategies for them. And you know, as with nearly all things legislation in the state, 99% of people do the right thing. Where the industry, and this is you and your role as part of an organising committee or a sports body or one of your horse organisations, this is an additional component to what this shared responsibility concept is. So you now as an event organiser take on some of that responsibility for the control mechanisms that need to be put in place. So what are those things that you need to do? Are there legislated requirements that you need to abide by? There's a couple, and we'll get to them soon. Or are there just general things that you need to implement to ensure that your individual competitors can do their best to abide by their general biosecurity obligation, and you as the committee are playing your role in that? And then clearly the third part of that is the government. And as I've said, we aren't any longer in the space of that day-to-day management of it, but what we are very clearly in the space of is establishing those frameworks, the provision of the information so that the individual and the community can implement those things and manage them themselves. And then also we have what we call the step-in powers if and when things go wrong. So whilst the GBO is the General Biosecurity Obligation is the underpinning concept on this Act, the government still does have very significant powers to step in and make things happen when they feel they need to make it happen. So this slide here, the General Biosecurity Obligation, is the whole crux of the new Biosecurity Act. If I slip into acronyms, forgive me please, I've been in the government too long. So this General Biosecurity Obligation, or the GBO, that is increasingly being used. Excuse me. And you'll see there's a few key terms in there that you'll need to start to understand and get your head around, both as an individual and as the event organisers. So the obligation, similar to a duty of care, requires that all people who deal with a biosecurity matter or a carrier, if they know or ought reasonably to know that it poses a biosecurity risk, take all reasonable and practical measures to prevent or minimise that risk. Okay, that is literally taken from the legislation, and that's what the General Biosecurity Obligation is. So there's a couple of key terms in there. The biosecurity matter, for again in our world, that'll be literal diseases, so Hendra virus, cattle tick, strangles, herpes, whatever it might be, and the carrier. So you're dealing with a carrier, and in this situation the carrier will be your animals. If you're off rural property, then you may need to consider other things that might be considered carriers. Again, previously mentioned, the banana tree is a carrier of the disease called Panama. So Panama is the biosecurity matter, the banana tree is the carrier. Now these next bits are the real crux of this whole thing, and this is what if a person knows or ought reasonably to know that that matter and carrier poses a biosecurity risk. And this is a role where you as the event organising committees kick in, and these are the elements of the biosecurity plan that you need to establish. Consider carefully those risks that may be presented by animals attending your event, and what are those mitigation factors that you need to ensure are being put in place by your competitors, okay? So ought reasonably to know or to know is going to be different for a lot of different people. Okay, you as event organisers have clearly probably been in the industry for a significant period of time, so your level of knowledge and understanding of the risks that are associated with horse events is going to be different to someone brand new to this world. Okay, I use Pony Club as the example. Some out there might be in the Pony Club and they may have heard me talk to this previously. The Pony Club is very much used as an entry level for smaller children to join the horse riding world. Okay, little Johnny and Mary, Mummy, I want a horse. Mummy goes and gets them a horse, never having seen the back end of one in their previous life, and they have an 8-year-old kid out there on those animals, and they start wandering the countryside going to events. Okay, their level of ought reasonably to know is going to be completely different to someone who's been in the industry for 20 years, who's been all around the state, who is now part of an organising committee and has a great deal more knowledge. Okay, that does not excuse Johnny and Mary and Mum and Dad. They have a responsibility to go and find out those things that they need to find out. And clearly then the government, first place we should be able to give Johnny and Mary that information is in this day and age on our website, or the provision of information via organisations such as yourselves, Equestrian Queensland, Pony Club Queensland, all the rest of it. And then you guys kick in as that industry organisations in the middle there somewhere of the provision of that information, and to ensure all your competitors are well aware of what are the risks that are associated with holding an event at your particular place. Okay, so this is again part of the ability to be flexible. Excuse me. An event being held at the top of the range in Toowoomba is going to come with a completely different set of risks for an event being held down around Boona Bay Desert, and they're going to come with completely different set of risks to someone holding an event out in Charleville. Okay, the length of time of your event is another significant factor. Again, you know, a state championships, it'll go for a week and a half. People are coming from all over the state in a variety of different risk areas, and accumulating at your place for a week and a half, which is long enough for most diseases to have gone through an incubation period and express, that is a completely different thing to someone who's holding their gymkhana on a Sunday morning where all the kids come from locally, 10 kilometres within a 10-kilometre zone, and they're there for 2 hours and dissipate home again. So that's why we're not hard and fast and prescriptive anymore. It's all about you identifying what are the risks associated with your event and dealing with them. And then the next step, the next key part of that whole GBO definition then is to take all reasonable and practical measures to prevent or minimise that risk. And again, this applies to the individual as well as the committees and event organisers. So again, you've identified those risks. What are those risks? What are now reasonable and practical measures for you to take to prevent or minimise those risks? And this is clearly where it now starts to link in with all your biosecurity plans. I think the horse industry is really well positioned because of the work they've done in the past 4 or 5 years. Some of the work that we've been doing with you is because a lot of the organisations already now have in place biosecurity plans. Okay, I hope you're all well aware of what your local club's one is. If not, this presentation isn't necessarily about biosecurity planning because we have been through that before. I do have a few slides on it just to give a general concept. But the concept of a biosecurity plan now are all of those things that you as event organisers, those are the measures that you can do that are very reasonable and very practical to either prevent or minimise the spread of that particular risk. Okay, so the basics of the plan that you guys have is the vast majority of us now all have the straight up front is your horse health declaration. So that's straight away you as the organising committee saying to your competitors, we don't want sick horses on this ground. We only want the horses that are here and healthy and are going to participate in this event. So these are some of your organisation's rules, and that's the upfront one. There is the is the horse health declaration. Then for you guys who have been heavily involved in the planning process, you'll also know then that you've gone to probably lengths to identify isolation areas, you know, hygiene stands, places to wash hands, rules about not sharing equipment, individual water buckets, all of those things that you've identified as things that can spread biosecurity risk. So it looks like we might have a question.
A couple of questions, yeah. So first one is around tick areas. So if an event is being held, for example, on the Downs, what should event organisers expect people from tick-infected areas to bring with them to prove that their horses aren't carrying ticks?
All right, good question. And at the moment, we're still in heavy consultation with industry at all levels, both the cattle industry and the horse industry, to define exactly where we think what things need to occur for people to be able to abide by their general biosecurity obligation. At the end of the day, there will be something that we will get each individual to do to declare what they have done to make sure they're not carrying this thing called cattle tick across the line. Once we have landed on exactly what those requirements will be, they will be very much communicated to you guys as event organisers, and it could be as hard and fast as what we currently work with now, although we are all sincerely hoping that is not the case. But if it does, you know, it still could be pull up at Hellerton and get your certificate of inspection and treatment, all the rest of it, or it could be simply you abiding by a series of guidelines, inspecting your own animals. If you're in a bit of a risky area when you do have cattle on your own property, we might give you options to treat your own animals with chemicals, and then we would get you to have some sort of declaration on your weigh bill / horse health declaration into the future. Once we've decided on those, we'll be communicating them to you loud and clearly.
Great. And a second question, Do the organising committees have a responsibility to make all of this information available, and to what level?
Yep, and another good question, because that comes back to the business of what is reasonable and practical for you to be able to do. So the RNA is an organising committee, and they're supported by professionals in their job, paid people, veterinarians, organisers, all the rest of it. So the expectations on them is totally different to what it is, again, to keep banging on about it, the Charleville Pony Club, because they're just a bunch of mums and dads that get together every Sunday morning to give an opportunity for the kids to be able to ride a horse. So the expectations on them are going to be different. We will be in the business of providing all of those committees with as much possible information as we can give them, and then what is reasonable and practical for them to hand on to their members from there. That'll be determined on how, as I say, you know, whether you're full-time, whether you're professional, what is your ability. But there's going to be some sort of level of information flow from you guys out. It's not acceptable to have no information purely because you're a bunch of volunteers, but we wouldn't expect, as I say, you guys to be putting out the similar types of information to what the RNA is, who are an organisation that are supported by professionals.
One final question, I don't know if this is a question that you want to answer now, whether this might be more applicable towards the end, but how is the event organiser responsible if a competitor doesn't follow the biosecurity rules that the organising committee put in place and there's a biosecurity incident?
Sure, and that's another really good question. We do not expect you guys to be the policemen. We are the policemen. We are the people with the powers that can come in over the top and make things happen legislatively. However, having said that, if we turn up an event and someone has clearly done something wrong, whether it's in relation to ticks or they've brought a sick horse on there and we're talking now lockdown for Hendra or something like that, and if we see that you as the event organisers have done nothing around that and have communicated nothing to your participants in relation to what your expectations of them are, then you as a committee have failed. Okay, if you have communicated that to your participants and you have said these are the rules for entry into our situation, as soon as you identify sick horses, you're to report, you're to isolate, etc., and even then you can have rules if your chief steward or chief veterinarian or whatever decides that an animal should not stay on the property and requests they remove themselves. Again, you have no powers, you have no authority to do that. Oh, sorry, you may under your clauses of whatever your ground rules are. But if people choose to refuse to do that, then that's that individual's role in this whole process, okay? You can only do so much that is reasonable and practical. As I said, you are not the policeman of the system. We do not expect you to be the policeman of the system. That is not reasonable and not practical for you to be that. But the provision of that information to the individuals, I believe that is reasonable and practical for you to communicate that to your members, and it's very definitely reasonable on behalf of that individual to abide by those rules of your organisation. Okay, cool. So that's the underpinning concept of the GBO, and as I say, you guys with your biosecurity planning process that you've put in place in the past 4 or 5 years, I think you're really well positioned to put in processes under the Act when it comes in next year on July 1. A lot of work still to be done, and the vast majority of it is around communication and tidying up those biosecurity plans. We did start the whole planning process post EI and sort of it got a fair bit of momentum during 2011 for the reasons I'm sure you all know. So a lot of people picked it up and ran with it there, and I'm probably not telling you anything that in some situations, some of the biosecurity planning has got a little bit loose in the last 12 months to 2 years. And again, because, and this is typical, I well understand that, is because unless people are constantly challenged around what might be popping up, then everybody tends to go, oh yeah, it won't happen to me, and things become a little bit loose. So there's only a few little bits and pieces that you'll probably need to do as organisers to really sharpen ththose things up and get them back into a really good spot. Okay, it's usually at this point we have a bit more interactive question and answering, but that's a little bit tougher here, so I'll just persevere as best I can. Keep yelling those questions out around that GBO concept if you've got them. I do appreciate that this is something brand new. and it may be causing some confusion. So then the biosecurity plan, again, we'll just rush over this a little bit quickly because this is, as I say, most of you have probably already participated in a biosecurity plan or be well aware of what your committee's plan is. So it's just simply the series of that steps that outlines those precautions that you are going to take to minimise the risk of pests and diseases. And as I've already said, it should be developed to suit your event and your venue, and that's why we've never been in the business of just simply handing out a plan and saying implement that. It's got to be for your event and your situation, and you know how you manage your grounds, you know where your participants are coming from. We broadly try and break that into the three areas of the things. So it's about prevention of the introduction of disease onto the grounds, prevention of spread of disease within the grounds, and then minimising the effect and spread of a disease incident. So again, as you can see, that clearly links to what are those reasonable and practical steps that you can take to prevent and or minimise the spread of a disease. Murphy's Law always kicks in. We don't expect fully to be able to prevent every incident. But once an incident has been identified, the next step that you can do is about minimising the effect of that disease, okay? So clearly, again, banging on about what the plans that you've already done, the prevention of the introduction of the disease, and that's clearly what your horse health declarations is all about. Straight up front, it gets the people to declare, I have a fit and healthy horse, and I know that because I've done certain things for the previous week when I've monitored it as I've been grooming it and all the rest of it. So those are big ticket things. The prevention of the spread and disease within, and again, some of the biggest shows that I've been to, certainly the ECA, they've minimised a lot of that contact, human-horse contact. A lot more signage up around the place to ensure people are aware of what the risks are and keep them away from those things. So the sharing of equipment within the grounds, try to be as restrictive as you can where the animals are floating around the grounds, in particular for those events that are lasting for a few days and are bigger events. And then the third concept, the big what if happens, what do we do? What's our preparations if the balloon does go up and we do have an issue? And that all revolves around knowing who to call, when to call, who is making those decisions. Do you have a veterinarian, a consulting veterinarian on hand? What role do you need them to play? All of those bits and pieces, and it's all just documented out before the day so that there's no panic stations. Everyone can clearly go to their plan and just implement it if it happens on the day. So I'm just going to just rattle through this a little bit just to get to this bit. Okay, so the concept of movement records, for those of you who have been around long enough, years ago when I first joined the job, every movement of a horse had to fill out what was called a concessional permit or a travelling stock declaration in those days. And then we dropped that all together, and the movements of horses had no requirement at all to fill out any type of waybill. Then equine influenza struck and we brought back in the waybill, and then all of a sudden you had to fill out a waybill again. And then equine influenza disappeared and we dropped the waybill component again. We are reintroducing it. However, we are reintroducing it in a very, what we hope is easy and modern way, and we don't use terms such as waybill or horse health declaration or vendor declaration or anything like that. We're saying we want you to keep movement records. So every time you move from your home property to somewhere else, we just simply want you to keep a record somehow of what you've moved, when you moved it, where it went, where it came from, where it went, and what it was that you moved, okay? Write that down on the back of a cigarette paper, email it to yourself, keep it on an Excel spreadsheet at home. In this day and age, everybody has an iPhone and there's notes in there. We don't care what format that you keep it in, but we want you to keep it, and we want you to be able to produce it to us when we ask the question. Anything written is better than the world's best memory, and one of the drivers of this is all around some of our HENDA responses. And for those of you who have heard me speak previously, you'll be sick of this story, but it is genuinely true, and it's one of the drivers of why we want movement records. When we go to incidences, we look at what has moved off the property, because clearly we want to track anything else that's potentially infected. And we went to one of the infected properties during 2011 and said what animals have moved, and he gave us advice that a certain animal moved on the Sunday prior. Okay, that was within 7 days of contact with the infected horse. We went down the road to his mate's place where the horse moved, and we were about to quarantine that property, and he said, no, definitely not that day, it was the Sunday before. Now, each one of those vowed and declared they knew exactly when the movement occurred, because in one situation it was the local show, and I had a beer with you that night, and we organised it, and we said we'd do it the next day. That's how I know it was that. And the other bloke said, no, it wasn't the show. We were met up at the RSL. It was my wife's birthday. I know we had a beer, and we organised it for that day. Now, that is critical information to us, and simple memory slips from that made the difference between us quarantining a property, or even worse than that, that particular gentleman having a potentially infected horse on his property. So we want to keep it as simple as is possible, but we certainly are saying to you now, every time you move a horse, that's the individual's role. Then from an event organiser's role, it is also a responsibility for you to keep records of what is on your grounds and when they arrived at those grounds and when they left at those grounds. Okay, and again, we're not prescriptive of what we want. We just want certain information. So we've left that to be flexible, because you'll decide what the best methodology is depending on a multitude of things. Certainly we have a lot of the camp drafters tell us their nomination system, is much more electronic nowadays, and for the sake of a tweak of a few buttons, they reckon they'll be able to accumulate their movement records via their noms process. And if that works, that's great. What we need to know is who's turned up, what horse they've brought, when they've arrived on grounds and when they've left. If you so choose to make your people continue to complete those horse health declarations, bring 2 copies and you keep one and they take the other one home, then great, that might be the way it works as well. So those things are being flexible for you guys, but that will be one of the new legislated bits of the Act. It's probably slightly different to what it is now. And the second principle there is the prevention of the spread within the grounds. And again, I won't necessarily need to go on about that. That's part of the basic biosecurity planning process. So, and then the principle 3 is prevention and spread. Minimise the effect of a disease. That's the what if clause. So I will. So in fact, that's apologies for skipping across the biosecurity planning process. We have done that before. Equestrian Queensland and all your key clubs, subsidiary organisations, your pony clubs and all that, the Alliance, they all have these in template form, and they all have produced workshops before around biosecurity planning. So again, if your particular organisation hasn't been through one of these, then contact your parent organisation and progress that. We can contribute to a small extent, but as I say, we're not in the business of writing up your biosecurity plans. It's really something you need to consider for yourselves.
What we're talking about biosecurity plans, I've got a few questions that come through.
Sure.
So the first one is there a website we can go to learn more about biosecurity plans and how to make one? Obviously, the Equestrian Queensland website does have a biosecurity template that event organisers can use and adapt to their own. Is there another website?
Yes, Animal Health Australia has a huge horse biosecurity planning page. Can I recommend that you start with the basic one that would be on the Equestrian Queensland site? That's the one that we sort of developed in consultation with each other. It is quite basic, and I think it's the best entry-level process that you can do. If you go straight to the Animal Health Australia website, you'll see that it's about a 50-page manual, and I know the vast majority of people look at that and just go, this is too daunting, it's too hard. So it's not too daunting, it's not too hard. It is a simple process, and as we say, we've broken it down into those 3 stages. But just start basic and then put that into practice at one of your events, and then you'll have a look at the things that can be improved, and you can build upon from there. And can I also just say, sorry, Christine, a key element of your biosecurity plan is to communicate it to your competitors, okay? You as the organising committee can have the best biosecurity plan under the sun, but unless your competitors know about it and know what it is and what the rules are, then it's meaningless.
And just a few questions on your horse movement. So will the record be on a prescribed form, which I think you've already answered as far as you're concerned. They just need to keep a record. Again, there is a horse health declaration on the Equestrian Queensland website that is ideal for event organisers to use.
If your organiser so chooses to develop up their own template, then great, go for it. There is a free one that you can access via the department's website at the moment that you can print off. It is a little bit clunky and you do need a fairly stupid bandwidth on your computer to be able to access it, but it does sit there. Or simply make up one yourself on your home computer and photocopy 50 of them.
How long do organisers need to keep the records for?
2 years.
And will event organisers at any time be audited for compliance?
In an ideal world, that is a clear part of one of our roles, is monitoring the systems to make sure these things happen. In the early days of the implementation of this Act, we are going to have our tail ends out just simply implementing and developing information for the use of organisers. But as I say, at some point into the future, into the ideal world, yes, that will be clearly the government's role to monitor and make sure these things are happening.
And then the last one is from the president of a show society, and they share the grounds with a local pony club.
Yeah.
So where there are organisations that share grounds, they're just clarifying that these health decks would need to be used at all times, whether it's an event or just members that are bringing their horses to the grounds to exercise or train their horses. Is that correct?
Yeah, it does get a little bit tricky when in those shared ground components. So you probably should sit down with as many of those users of those facilities as you possibly can and negotiate the best outcome for that one. We have an expectation that someone will be keeping and accumulating that information for us. It is very difficult if you're, say, the pony club and you're using a facility just once a week and you're doing the best for the pony club, but you know it's being used by other individuals throughout the week. So ultimately someone's in control of that grounds, whether it's the local council or committee or whatever. Ultimately someone's in control. So we do have an expectation that we'd be able to find somebody to provide us with those records. I know some of the multiple use grounds. I'm from Toowoomba. I know the Toowoomba Showgrounds, the show society there has its rule that all groups using the Toowoomba Showgrounds will have a biosecurity plan in place. They don't develop the biosecurity plan for those groups, but that is straight up their rule, and they do keep a check on that, as far as I'm led to believe. So, but sit down with your fellow users of those grounds and sort of come to an agreement of how you go about it. But again, it goes back to what you, as your particular organisation, what is reasonable and practical on your behalf, and it's not your responsibility to be making other groups and other individuals do the right thing just because you're on the same set of grounds. You can only do what you can do for your particular group. So I've pretty much run out of steam. I think that's about the hour anyway, as an entry level. There will be a lot more things as they're developed, and clearly for you guys, cattle tick will be one key area of interest, and we'll be communicating that to you as soon as we possibly can. We are keen to start this, or not start, continue this process across the state, talking around what the GBO means in relation to your event organisations. This webinar is a perfect way of doing this. I'm used to standing in front of people and talking, but this is a great way of getting it out to a broader audience. So if you have other organisations out there that are keen to participate in one of these workshops, please give me a call, but just be aware I am one of only about 3 across the state at this point, sort of here to be able to talk to groups. So we want to try and keep it at a bit of a higher level and amongst the executives and the organising committees of groups, and then have an expectation that they take that message to their members. So we want to just try and get as big a bang for buck as we possibly can. So keep those questions coming. We've got a last few.
Yeah. So one going back to the tick topic. So one organising committee run their events in a tick area and have competitors coming from tick-free areas. Is it the organising committee's responsibility to those competitors to make sure they have their horses tick-free before they return home, or is that the owner's responsibility?
It's the owner's responsibility to have the horse tick-free before they return home. You, as your organising committee, it would be something that I would consider to be reasonable and practical for you, knowing full well that you have a certain percentage of your competitors coming down the hill, to be able to provide those people with good information and maybe in facilities where they can do those treatments on your grounds. So that would be something that we would look at, what's reasonable, practical for you. You know, I can probably take a guess at where you're situated, but without naming specifics, you know, some of those places that are just below the range that clearly get a deal of numbers of animals from the downs, then I would hope that you would be communicating to your participants from that part of the world that you're now in the tick infected area, and that comes with an elevated risk of taking ticks home, so they need to ensure they do the right thing to get those animals home.
A couple more on ticks. So with spraying for travelling, will the individual be able to spray and produce a stat deck at the border to travel interstate? Do you know what the other states required?
Yeah, this is, we're still in negotiation with New South Wales as to how much they will accept from us. Primarily, New South Wales usually follow our lead on a variety of things. When we introduced the third-party provider system, it took them a couple of years to look at it and assess it and then finally go, yep, okay, that system works, we'll accept that. So we have an expectation that New South Wales will accept whatever system we put in place. How quick that happens, we're not too sure. It may happen quicker than previous years because New South Wales have just implemented a new Biosecurity Act that also works along similar lines. So they're already thinking around those things, so they might already be in a way better space than they have in previous years. But it's certainly one issue that we have to work around with them. We are certainly hoping that we can reduce the burden to what it currently is, which is clearly, as you'd be aware, pulling up at Arachula or Helidon, unloading, spraying, reloading, all the rest of it. We are certainly hoping to reduce that burden.
As far as horse movements or horse health checks go, are scanned copies of those okay for
Absolutely.
to keep?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
And is there a penalty in the legislation for failure to comply?
A failure to comply with a GBO is a significant penalty. It's a couple of hundred penalty units, which is $150 odd per penalty. No, $120 odd per penalty unit. So there's fines of upwards of 50, 80 grand as an individual. So there are significant penalties within this act. Another option that we would have is if something. This is all about an outcome. So you're only going to get these. You're only going to be looked at for prosecution if an outcome is poor. So we will work with you in the first instance if we identify something's going wrong. But it's only about an outcome that's poor. So if you have taken cattle ticks somewhere else, or if you have spread equine influenza, or pity help, if you have moved a hen or a horse somewhere, you know, that's clearly going to be a poor outcome, and that's when we do have an ability to kick in, and there are significant fines.
Regarding travelling between tick areas, currently it's been away for 5 days or more that people have to stop at an inspection area and be sprayed. Will that still be the case?
And again, we haven't finally landed on the position that all of industry will be comfortable with. We are desperately hoping to get away from that whole concept of 5 days, 14 days longer. We are more wanting to put the responsibility back onto the individual to assess what risk they have with their horses and to do certain things with those horses. And one of those certain things may be to spray them with your own chemical at home, or it may simply be to inspect those animals to go into the free area. So that's what we hope, but there's a lot of negotiation to go just yet with that. So we are certainly wanting to make it less burdensome at the moment, because again, one of the underpinning concepts under the Act is it's all about the risk. And we know that the secondary species, your horses, are a lot lower risk of spreading cattle tick than cattle. They can and do spread cattle tick, but they are very much a lower risk. So, you know, we're sick of being in the business of spraying the daylights out of a horse that's come from 5 acres on the edge of Brisbane that's never even heard of a cattle tick, let alone seen it. So those are the sorts of things we're trying to move away from. But there is, as you'd be well aware, a significant other breadth of opinion within the cattle world around cattle ticks. So, yep.
And what I think is our last question, which you may well have answered earlier on, in the event of a suspected Hendra case at an event, is the event placed in lockdown without positive confirmation of it actually being Hendra?
No, our current policy is that we only put in place restrictions on an event once we have a positive test, and that policy will go forwards. The difference being in this day and age now is at the moment, whilst there might be something suspicious at the grounds, nothing can occur legislatively until we get that definitive test coming out of a laboratory, and then Biosecurity Queensland would act, and we would come in and restrict movements and do those assessments based on what contact other horses have had with the known infected ones. Into the future now, and this is why it's so important for you to have an event veterinarian, if not on grounds, depending on how big you are, at the very least have identified one. So when these things come up, if it's looking like a duck and quacking like a duck, you need to probably implement things in accordance with what your biosecurity plan is saying to prevent the spread of that disease, okay? To be honest, let's not use Hendra as an example, because Hendra, it doesn't spread readily. It does spread from horse to horse and certainly from horse to human, and it has lethal effects when it does spread. Let's use equine influenza as an example and what happened there at Morgan Park. We had no ability to shut the gates, and neither did the organisers. That thing was looking like a duck and quacking like a duck, and word started to get out amongst the competitors, and so half a dozen of them decided the best option for me was to leave these grounds. That actually contributed to the spread and didn't prevent those animals getting that disease. We had no mechanism, either us as government or the organisers, to prevent the movement of those horses. Under this concept, until we get that definitive result out of a laboratory, lots of other things can now happen. You as event organisers can communicate to your participants. We look like we have a problem here. It looks like equine influenza. We are saying to you, do not move your horses from these grounds. It will lead to the spread of this disease. Okay, that's your GBO done as an event organiser. The individual now knows they have something serious called equine influenza. And if I move from that ground, I'm liable for a breach of my GBO because I'm potentially going to spread that thing around the countryside. So that is the difference in the conversation that you guys now, and that is what is reasonable and practical for you to do. Again, you're not the policeman. We don't expect you to chain the gates up and stand there with armed guards and prevent everybody to move, but we would have an expectation that you would communicate those things that you know to your competitors and advise them of the seriousness of the situation, and then they straight away have their GBO to abide by and have to do their best to prevent and minimise the spread of that disease.
Just relating to that, one last question. I think we'll make this our last question. So with Hendra, or I guess any disease, if somebody brings a horse to an event and it does have Hendra or any other disease and it spreads, is that likely enough to be able to apply a penalty, or is it only if that person knowingly or purposely brings that horse to the event knowing that it has been showing symptoms of being sick, that they've lied on the horse health declaration?
Yep. And that all forms part of the what that ought reasonably to know, and that forms part of our investigation process with those as the individuals. For you as an event organiser, as soon as you identify those sick animals, if you take action to isolate them, talk to the owner, your rules are don't bring sick horses in. That's all you can do. If people so choose to make that decision to bring a sick horse in, then part of our investigation with them will be, what is it that you ought have reasonably to known about the health of your horse? What do you think was going on here? And that would be part of our investigation. If it did turn out to be something serious like Hendra, and they knew that animal was crook, but they still wanted to compete because little Johnny wanted his blue ribbon for this Sunday, you can rest assured, and the outcome was bad, such as there was a Hendra infected horse on that grounds, you can rest assured we would be taking actions against those individuals.
Right, well, I think we'll call it an evening there. If there are any outstanding questions that have come through in the last 30 seconds or so, we'll try and get those answered. We hope that this has given you some information about the new legislation. Thank you to David for giving the presentation and answering your questions. Thank you to everyone for attending. This will be available as a video, so we'll get that sent out to you as soon as possible, and we'll also email out copies of the Equestrian Queensland Biosecurity template and horse health declaration, and I think David's also got a leaflet that we can include on that, so you've got some more information. So
yeah, I will provide Christine with a link to our website, and you can sign up to an e-alert, which will be information on the Act put out every 2 to 3 weeks. That'll keep you up to date for alerts and information. So
great.
Cool.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me.